Okay, once our ISO is downloaded, then we can proceed with getting VMCloak installed and then setting up our first virtual machine. In order to do that, we have to make this Win7 directory under mount. And what you might find here is that if you try to execute the command, you'll get a permission denied. So what I did to get around that was to create the directory as the root user, and then use the change ownership command in order to change that directory back to Cuckoo. So here you can see using sudo chown and then cuckoo:/cuckoo. So that should allow us now to issue the final command here, which will mount that ISO into that directory. And this is going to be a default location that VMCloak will look in order to build our VM. So we should be set at this point. Now, we're going to jump ahead because we already have VirtualBox installed. But before we get into installing, before we actually get into installing VMCloak, which we haven't done yet, we do need to make sure that we have all of these, these essential packages, this essential software installed. So some of it we may have already got with our, going through the requirements section earlier. But I do want to make sure here again that we didn't miss any packages. So we'll go ahead and just do again a copy paste and see if we pick up anything that we may have missed. Okay, and I think we have all of those as well, but again, just to be thorough. Okay, there we go. All right, the next step is to install VMCloak. And as you see here with this command, we could have done that alongside Cuckoo, but we didn't. And so it's no problem to install that. What we need to be, though, is still inside of our virtual environment. And if we paste this in, the only thing I'm going to modify here is that we have removed the Cuckoo install. Now, for this demonstration, you're going to see that everything's already been satisfied because I had to go back and redo something. So I've actually already installed it. But you'll see that it'll install like any pip package. As long as there are no errors, then we should be ready to use VMCloak. And we can, as long as there are no errors, we should be ready to use VMCloak. Now, VMCloak, if you're not familiar, is used for the automation of creating our virtual machines, and this can be very helpful because this allows us then it helps to deploy the agent into the VM, which will communicate then with Cuckoo. It can install certain software and packages for us, and it just generally tries to make things a bit easier. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this demo that we need to have the VBox 0 adapter created. This is a host-only adapter that will be used by Cuckoo in order to communicate with our VMs. This is the command to do that with VMCloak. If you've already created it, and we can go back to our VirtualBox host network manager, you can see it's already created. We can just remove it. That command then will create it for us. So we can just run vmcloak-vbox 0. Running that, we should see that we have the the successful status message. Of course, we can go back to VirtualBox and we can confirm using the same network manager. There it is, and we should be set. Okay, the final step here, well, I shouldn't say the final step. The next step is to create our virtual machine. And for this, there's a couple things to consider, one of which is the number of CPUs and the RAM size. So in this blog, they're suggesting 2 CPUs and a little over 2 gigs of RAM. Why they're doing that is because you'll see a lot of malware. One of the kind of the basic things that they look for to determine if they're in a sandbox or an analysis environment is a limited number of CPUs and a small amount of RAM. And there's other things like the hard drive size and if a mouse is present and things like that. So getting slightly larger numbers just helps to create a VM that looks a little bit more like a normal or a legitimate user system. On the flip side of that, though, of course, is that it's going to create maybe some issues down the road for you. For example, if you are using volatility and you're taking image dumps of your analysis machines, then every time it dumps the memory, depending on how you have it set up, you might have very large memory dumps that you're now filling your disk with, and that also maybe take a little more time when analyzing with tools like volatility. So some things to consider here as you explore the way in which you want to leverage Cuckoo. So we'll grab that command, we'll paste it into our terminal, and now we should be able to give it a few minutes here in order to go through the process of creating this base VM for us. One more step that you want to make sure that you follow here, just in case, since we skipped the VirtualBox setup section here, is to make sure that our Cuckoo user is added to the VBox users. Now, you'll see that that should have been done here. If we go back to the original Cuckoo docs, we should have added it right there. But I've run into some issues here where if you don't, just make sure that you did that, you're going to get some errors when trying to run these VMCloak commands. So just as a note here, even if you decide to skip some sections because you've maybe already done some of the setup, it's definitely worth going through and just making sure that there aren't any commands that maybe are still applicable or relevant or just need to be followed. So once we are all set, now we should be able to run our VMCloak init. And this should take a few minutes, but so we'll resume here once this base VM is created. Okay, if all goes as planned, then you should see that ultimately your VM that you've just created should be added to the repository. So now our next step is to create a clone, and as the guide here describes, the reason that we're doing that is that once the snapshots have been created, and that's how how Cuckoo is going to work, is that every time that every time you launch a VM, it's going to restore to a snapshot in order to then perform the analysis. So once those are created, you can't change them. So what the blog here is suggesting is that you create a clone of this base VM, and then that way you can use that base VM to make multiple clones, and you don't have to go through this process of building that VM every single time. So now we have our clone. You probably realize that's a much quicker command to execute. And you have now the ability to create, the different configurations that you want. Do you want your VM to have Office? Do you want it to have Flash? Do you want it to have PDF Reader? And we're not going to get into all of the, the different configurations here. You can see that there are commands to help you list all of the different packages. Some of them, of course, like installing Office, will require that you have, a license key to install, or you're going to get prompted every time in order to activate that version of Office. So here you can see an example where you have to input the serial key. So again, a number of different options that are available to you. I just want something simple so that we can get Cuckoo up and running. We'll set this up with IE11 just to go through an example of how we can now install that inside of this Win7 x64 Cuckoo, so this clone of the VM. The next step then is to actually create the snapshots. So we'll just use the same command here as is in the tutorial, and we'll see those snapshots are created. Once those are done, we will then be able to, or we should be able to, of course, list the VM. So we can use this command in order to see and really confirm that those snapshots are created and now available for us to use. Once that's complete, now we can finally get into configuring Cuckoo, and we're almost ready to have Cuckoo up and running. Now we can essentially confirm the creation of the VMs for us. All right, our final step here is to configure Cuckoo. And the first thing we need to do is to perform a Cuckoo init. That will create and populate the structure of what they call the Cuckoo working directory. If you would like to, you can actually explore doing multiple different configurations, and you can define different locations by providing the --cwd path or argument here. But we're gonna stick with the defaults for now. So we'll run Cuckoo init. We'll do that inside of our virtual environment, and we should then, after this command completes, have the necessary structure, the configuration files, and everything that we need in order to take the next steps. Here you can see the output. It's created the .cuckoo directory from your home user account. Mine is just happened to be Cuckoo. And now we can navigate into that folder. And if I could type, that would be very helpful. You'll see all of the different folders and files that are available. Where we need to kind of focus next is in the configuration folder. So we'll go into conf, and you'll see there are a number of configuration files here. The important ones will be cuckoo.conf, processing.conf, and virtualbox.conf, as well as routing.conf. So there's a number of these here that we're going to change, make some small modifications just to get Cuckoo up and running. Now, there is a section here in the blog as well as in the Cuckoo docs for setting up your Postgres as your DBMS, your database management system. By default, Cuckoo is going to use SQLite. And instead of going through all of this, I think you've should have a pretty good handle at this point in terms of getting these packages installed and everything. So if you want to make the change, now is probably the best time to do that. For the demo, though, I'm not going to make these changes because it's just getting a bit lengthy. And so we'll go with, or I'll stick with the default SQLite setup. So now there's a couple of things we need to do. One of the first things that I like to do is to update signatures and other things that behave inside of Cuckoo. So we run Cuckoo Community from our virtual environment, because remember we installed Cuckoo in this virtual environment. And so Cuckoo is only available as that Python package inside of this environment. So if we weren't in here and we tried to run any Cuckoo commands, we would get an error. You should see that this has finished fetching and extracting the community files. So now we have some signatures and some other things that are really going to help with the analysis of our malicious samples. Now, in order to add those virtual machines, you can go directly into the VirtualBox.configuration. And you'll see there are a number of options here. I'm actually going to change this to GUI. I like to see the VM run, at least initially, until I know everything is set up and running. So that way I can see the VM launch, I can see what happens inside of it, and just kind of monitor things until, again, I get my installation and my setup to a steady state, a happy state. We have the interface, we have the name of the machines, as you can see here. This will then become a comma-separated list of values for each machine that you want to define. So this machine label has to match up with the label that's defined here, and then this has to match up with what we define inside of the virtual box setup. We have the IP, the snapshots, and the interface and the result server IP. So this is going to give us the ability to define different, what is the operating system running in the host, what is the actual IP that it's using. Multiple VMs will likely have, as you saw with our previous step, multiple IPs. The snapshot that we're going to use, you can optionally define the interface if it's a deviation. Same with the result server IP. This is your host. So this is so that your VM that is running knows how to send information that was collected inside of that VM back to the host so that you can actually see it. So all of this can be done manually. And if you want to add additional VMs, then you essentially just copy this section and you start creating those additional configurations. So as long as you have this label here and these labels are defined. One of the first things, one of the many things that Cuckoo will do when it starts is it'll look to ensure that these VMs are configured. Now we have, since we've been following this tutorial, we also have the ability to just use VMCloak. And so what we can do is just take this command and we can let this command go ahead and do essentially do the population for us. And so we can use this Cuckoo machine in order to add the name of the VM as well as the IP. So we don't necessarily have to modify this file by hand. Of course, if you modify the file by hand, oops, I did actually want to do that. It's prone to typos and other things. So you won't get validation again until you started Cuckoo. So we'll paste this command in, we'll let this run, and hopefully what we should see here then is a number of VMs that are available now for us to use. Here we can see changes have already been made. We have our different VMs that are now available. We also, because you can see that there is one of the steps here is to remove the entries in the machines equals cuckoo one line. And so we do actually need to make that modification. So we'll get rid of that. And I'm going to leave that for now. I don't think that'll make a difference other than since we're not using it, we probably want to get rid of it. But that entry has, well, all these entries has quite a bit of documentation or notes to it. So I'll just go ahead and we'll just get rid of this one in its entirety. That way it won't potentially create an issue down the road. So delete that all the way down to the first VM that was defined here. Okay, now we'll save this file and we'll be able to move on to network configuration. All right, the next step is to perform the network configuration. And in order to do that, there's, again, a handful of commands here that you're going to need to execute. Keep in mind that this needs to be done from a terminal that you can run sudo from, and that you may need to actually, and you will need to make some changes based off of your interface. So they've gone with a default interface name of eth0. A lot of systems now don't use that naming convention anymore. So you can see, I think the only command here that it affects is this one. In order to determine your interface adapter name, you can do IPA, and you can see here this is ENS 160. So we have the local interface, our VirtualBox interface. This is ours. So to run this command, we just want to replace eth0 here with ENS 160. So once you've done that, now we're ready to start actually running Cuckoo. And there are a couple of different, kind of different interfaces or different services that we need to have running. And one of the things that I like to do is use something like Terminator in order to, we'll split this horizontally and then we'll split this vertically. And then that way I can kind of have everything up and running, and I can monitor it from there. So get the text a little bit larger. Okay, so as you can see here in the discussion is that there's the per analysis routing, which is more of an advanced setup. This is also discussed really at length here in the Cuckoo documentation. You can see under our installing section here that there is the per analysis network routing. So here is where you can go through and get a little bit more in-depth discussion about actually what's going on here. You'll see the same commands being set up, and different options. The per analysis, what's powerful about that is that you will be able to really have all of these different options. You'll be able to route through different VPNs if you set those up. You'll be able to set up a local instance of iNetSim. You'll be able to route directly to the internet, to do no routing, to do drop routing. You have all of these different options here. When it comes to setting up your sandbox, again, it's really up to you to determine how you want that routing to work, because malware that is not able to connect out to the internet, and it is oftentimes, the analysis there is a bit limited. We want to be able to allow that malware to connect out because it's going to drop payloads. It's going to get additional configuration information. It's going to, try to steal data from our VMs and allow us to, look at things like network signatures. So, it's really important to set this up. You also have to be very careful because you don't necessarily want malware running from your controlled infrastructure, revealing information about where you're at, and so using internet routing is quite a bit more risky than in that case. So really think through the different options here that are available, and then we'll talk about how to make those modifications there. Before we get into running that particular we'll come back to it. So we'll go to here. As you can see with the documentation, one of the things that we've been striving for here is to have a pseudo-less, a rootless setup. And so when we run the Cuckoo router, we want to make sure that we don't run this as sudo cuckoo. We want to avoid that. And if you run that initially with sudo cuckoo, it's going to create some files and folders that will then be created as the root user and might cause you some issues a little bit further down the road. Providing the --sudo flag will take care of the requirement of running the router and its initial need for those elevated privileges. So again, it's best to adhere to what the documentation is telling us. You see I ran the command there. I actually need to be in the virtual environment. So we'll go into the virtual environment. Now our prompt has changed and we can run that command again. We'll be prompted for the root user, the sudo password, and if everything is up and running correctly, then we should see that the router has started. Okay, after starting the router, then we do need to make a change to the configuration under routing.conf, and what we need to do is we want to change our internet route. So again, for this default here, we're just going to simply give our VMs a route directly out of our network to the internet. So just be cognizant of that, and I would suggest not running any malware. We want to go to routing.conf, and if you just scroll down a bit, you'll see under internet, you should have had your default value should have been none. And so you just change that into the default name of your host adapter, so ENS160 or whatever the output from running IP.A. Now you can save that file. We're going to run the web server here in just a moment, and so we're going to just need to go ahead. We might as well go ahead and make a change there. That's going to be under the reporting.conf, and what you want to look for is MongoDB, and your default here, this will be no. No. So go ahead and change that to yes. And once you do the apt install MongoDB, which we did at the very beginning, you should be able to just use all of these for the default. And then again, it's of course up to you to add authentication and make other changes as you see fit. So we'll change that. Now we'll change that. And now we're going to be able to start Cuckoo. So from one of my terminals here, again, I have these split just so I can monitor. I'm going to run Cuckoo, and what we're hoping to see is that essentially we get this loaded message that it's identified and loaded our virtual machines. You'll see this warning that that I haven't done the configuration for Postgres, but we did talk about that already. You may get these these messages about an inaccessible virtual machine. In this case, we're going to be able to still run, but at times you will find that your virtual machines, there may have been an error. And so what you need to do in that case then is to look at the virtual machines using VirtualBox. Sometimes you just need to verify that the snapshots are correctly, that they've been taken correctly, and that they're saved. You may need to revert your machine back to a snapshot. So here you can see I've got these inaccessible VMs. So it looks like maybe there was a slight mistake in how VMCloak set these up, or maybe how I ran the command. But the idea here then would be that we would clean these up or delete them, or just make them so that they're not a part of our VirtualBox configuration. There's a couple ways now that you can submit your samples or what you want to analyze to Cuckoo. One is through the command line. The other is through the web interface. And one of the last commands then that we're going to run is, scroll down here a little bit, this one right here. This will allow us to run the web server, and if we just simply add this to, again, in one of our virtual environment terminals, then what we should see is that the server is up and running and that we can quit that server with Control-C. So now we can go to our browser, localhost 8080, and this should be our interface for running Cuckoo. You can see I already ran a sample here and just testing for this demonstration. If you would like to clear Cuckoo at any point in time, one of the commands to do that is to do cuckoo clean. Just keep in mind that if you do that, I get an error here just because of the lack of Postgres integration here, and it removes everything, it clears everything. So just bear that in mind if you do that. But I find that helpful, especially as I'm just testing. Once I get my everything working and running, and I can go back and eliminate those tests. From here, we'll just submit a sample using a website. I'll use mine. We'll go submit. we may need to, since I did that clean, we may need to just start things. It looks like the interface there has become non-responsive. So we'll start the web interface again. We'll start Cuckoo again, and I'll just go ahead and refresh this. Now we'll hit submit. Choose the internet. So as you enable different routing options, those will become available here. And now you can choose other things like the time that the analysis should execute. I want something short. Different options here for what happens during analysis and some of the post-analysis processing. And then you can choose different VMs that are available. So I'll just go with the default. After that, you click Analyze, and because we made that change in the VirtualBox conf to use the GUI, you'll actually see the VM pop up here. And again, I like doing this because now I can see that the browser is opening, that it's going to connect out to the internet, and that everything appears to be working. And then once I'm happy with that, go back to the configuration and change that back to headless. Okay, and there we can see that we got out to the internet. Analysis is complete. We can watch the output here in our terminal. This is another thing that I oftentimes find myself as I'm setting up or maybe adding additional capabilities, looking at the different output here. For example, we see that there's an upload file length warning, so we may need to go into the cuckoo.conf and change the max upload size. We'll see the task is complete, and then other errors. So say, for example, we were to add Suricata to do analysis of the PCAP after the analysis is done. Then we could see, this is where we would monitor to make sure that the integration was complete. Before we wrap up, though, we'll revisit one more thing here. You'll notice that we have these inaccessible virtual machine errors. As I mentioned here, we can see that those are inaccessible in our VirtualBox configuration. So what we can do is we can try removing those. And now if we stop Cuckoo and we'll start Cuckoo again, those have now gone away. Of course, we want to also confirm that we didn't lose our VMCloak created virtual machines. So if we go back and just refresh on that command, VMCloak list VMs, we can copy that and paste that in. There they are. If you noticed earlier when we looked at this output, it may look a bit confusing. This is the name of the machine. So the name is adopted here with VMCloak as the IP address. So it's 101.1, 101.2, 101.3, 101.4, and then that's the actual IP for those. Okay, now let's say that we wanted to make another clone. I'll just call this temp because we're going to get rid of it. Now we can still issue the VMCloak clone command. So our base system is still there. We're just going to make a clone of that now. Okay, so now you should have a bare bones setup for Cuckoo, and you have a lot of different options that you can explore. I would encourage you to take a look at all of the different configurations because those will walk you through different capabilities. For example, if you take a look at processing.com, you'll see different, just different behaviors that you can enable and disable. I've been talking about Suricata a lot, so we can go down to the Suricata section. You can figure out how to configure Suricata. And again, all sorts of different options. So it's really the sky's the limit here in terms of taking your Cuckoo environment to the next level. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a lot from this. And if there's anything I can help with, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.